Morning folks, Dave Canterbury at the Pathfinder School. Continuing on with our basic series, talking about sleeping. And we talked about shelter and we talked about fire. We talked about disinfection of your ground source water and things of that nature in this series. And what I want to talk about now is sleeping and getting a good night's sleep. And we've talked about different configurations. We've talked about, hammock sleeping. We've talked about sleeping on the ground. We've talked about a raised bed. We've talked about pads and browse bags and things to keep us from having to battle too much with conduction. We've talked about controlling convection. We've talked about utilizing the radiant heat from the fire to keep us warm at night, understanding that if we really want to stay warm and we don't have the best sleeping system, we're going to have a large fire, a very large fire. The difference between a cook fire and a survival fire is about tenfold. So we need to understand that. One of the things that I've heard lately in discussions on different programs and on different discussion boards and things like that is, it kind of drives me crazy when you're talking about something and someone says, well, are you talking about a survival situation or are you talking about bushcraft? Well, the funny thing about that is that bushcraft can turn into survival. And people don't seem to get that through their head. They want to either go out and practice bushcraft or they want to go out and practice survival, and they don't realize that the two are intertwined, because one can become the other very easily. If I go out on a canoe trip for a day with my wife and my child, or my wife and my granddaughter, and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we're still 5 clicks away from our pickup point and the canoe spills over, and it's November or October in the state of Ohio where it's going to get down to 40 degrees, water temperatures are already dropped down around 65 to 70. Hypothermia is right around the corner at that point. Now it's not a weekend pleasure camping trip anymore or a daily canoe trip. Now it's a survival scenario. So it doesn't matter what else we were planning to do, whether it was bushcraft, canoeing, fishing, hunting, whatever the outdoor experience we planned for that day, it just became a survival scenario. And planning for that all the time is what's important. And that goes along with your sleep system as well. And you can practice with different types of sleeping equipment, but you have to have confidence in knowing that whatever you do, you're going to be able to sustain yourself in an emergency. So let's talk first about wool blankets. And I'm going to put a disclaimer on this discussion about wool blankets very quickly by telling you that there's no wool blanket on the planet that's going to be as warm as a sleeping bag. It's just not going to happen. So you've got to plan for that. And that goes back to your shelter setup option, your fire option, what you plan to do to keep yourself warm, understanding that you're not going to crawl into that wool blanket, roll up on the ground, and go to sleep without a fire in a very cold weather environment. Now, there are some sleeping bags that will keep you warm in very, very chilly weather. So the first one we'll talk about this one that's called a Baker bundle. And the reason I'm using this Baker bundle for an example is it's a very typical Dutch style trade blanket that would have been carried along the frontier. Most of the other ones would have been a bone or ivory white color. I do have one coming as a sample from the same company that makes the current wool blanket we carry on our website. That is 96 by 96 or queen size. I get a lot of questions about what size that wool blanket is and how big it is compared to military blankets. It's twice as big as far as width almost and longer. It is a queen size wool blanket. It's made out of solid merino wool. We'll talk about that in a minute too, because that keeps it from itching. This blanket is made from virgin wool. It's a very expensive handmade wool blanket. It's very, very warm within reason. If you've got your clothes on and you're dressed correctly and it's 30 degrees outside and you've got a decent, fire in front of a decent shelter, it's going to keep you warm. If it's below freezing outside, you don't have that good fire and you don't have a decent shelter, you're not going to roll up in this thing and go to sleep on the ground and be warm. It's just not going to happen. And you need to understand that and plan for that. But this wool blanket is a very, very good wool blanket, probably one of the best you can get. Pretty much Hudson Bay weight, again 96 by 96, but very expensive. So if you're just out practicing bushcraft or practicing frontier living skills and you want to understand what it's like to sleep with a wool blanket, what our forefathers went through to sleep with wool blankets in different situations, this is the wool blanket that I would recommend for very cold weather. Now, let's talk about the wool blanket that we sell on our website currently. The wool blanket we sell currently is a 96 by 96 merino wool blanket that is handmade in the USA, that is machine made in the USA. It's made from an operating woolen mill right here in the U.S. that takes the sheep on one end and comes out blankets on the other end, basically, if you want to look at it, you know, in the broad spectrum of things. This blanket is very warm. It's 96 by 96. For moderate temperatures, I would recommend this blanket if you're trying to go with a wool blanket option. It is kind of a fawn color. It's made out of merino wool to avoid the itch problem that you have with wool. It's not as thick as a Hudson Bay weight blanket. It's about half as thick, but it's every bit as thick as a military wool blanket as far as a U.S. wool blanket goes. And if you combine this with a sleeping bag, which we'll talk about here in a little while, then you really got something. And we're going to talk about combining wool blankets with sleeping bags here in a few minutes. But this blanket was meant for a milder temperature wool blanket. This is not a winter weight wool blanket. You need something more like the one that I talked about a minute ago, the Baker Bundle, or a Hudson Bay weight, what I call a Hudson Bay weight wool blanket. That's 96 by 96. And the secret to wool blankets that most people don't understand is you don't just fold them in half, crawl in them and lay down and go to sleep. You've got to lay that blanket in a diamond fashion, lay down in the middle of that diamond, and layer that thing up and roll into it so that you're cocooned under 2 or 3 layers of wool, trapping heat in between. And that's the key element to holding that body heat in, is to trap layers of heat. So that's what you do with a wool blanket. Now, let's talk real quick, get off the wool blanket kick for a minute, understanding that that is something that we're doing to understand how our forefathers lived in the wilderness. The other big advantage to wool is that it can be used as a garment as well as something to sleep in. The multifunctionality of the wool blanket is the key element to what I believe makes it such a vital piece of kit. It can be used for outerwear, it can be used for a shelter, it can be used to sleep with, all the other things that you cannot do with just a sleeping bag alone. So let's talk sleeping bags for a minute. If I'm going to use a sleeping bag, and I only have 3 that are my main use sleeping bags, and these 3 sleeping bags will get me through just about any weather condition, especially when combined with a wool blanket. Sometimes I combine it with a bivvy, sometimes I don't, but we're not really talking about bivvies in this video. We're talking about just sleeping bags and wool blanket sleep systems. The military sleeping bags are the ones that I would go with. They're going to be the tried and true, bulletproof, if you want to call it that, systems that have been tried and true over time. So the first sleeping bag that I'm going to show you is from a company called EcoTat. Now, I'm not always going to be able to tell you where to get this stuff. A lot of people say, where can I get that, where can I get that? But I can't always tell you. If I know where to get it, I will tell you in the video. This particular one was picked up at an Army surplus store for like $20, and it's a $400 sleeping bag that I'm not even sure they make anymore. But it was a sleeping bag that was designed for recon Marines, from what I've researched on it. It's by a company called EcoTat. The bottom of it is open with drawstrings so that you can sleep in it with your boots. It also has an opening in the bag itself in the center here that's Velcro shut so that it can be worn for a poncho liner. So it's a very versatile bag, but at the same time, the temperature rating of this bag is only about 40 degrees-ish. So once it gets cold, this bag alone is not going to cut it for you. Again, it's open at the bottom so you can sleep in it in your boots, which I wouldn't recommend unless you're, you know, on the run. So that makes it less of a good choice than a normal sleeping bag because it's open at the bottom, but it makes it more versatile in that it can be used for an outer garment as well. You're not going to be able to get around the fire with this thing. It's made out of nylon, and it's going to melt without a doubt. The one thing I like about this sleeping bag compared to some of the other military bags is that it has a center seam zip system on it. In other words, the zipper is in the center of the sleeping bag. It's not off to one side. So that makes it very easy to open if you're inside the bag, and you're not going to be laying on top of that zipper in the middle of the night if you have to get out of the bag. It does have a nice hood on it with a drawstring for a mummy type hood that you can drawstring down around you. Again, makes it good for outerwear as well, because you can put that hood on, open the bag all the way completely up. The bottom has no seam in it, so you can wrap that thing around you. But again, you're not going to do that around a fire very easily. So that sleeping bag is very good. I always keep my sleeping bags when they're traveling with me. If they're not with me, I like to keep them out of a bag just fluffed up in the closet or something so that they can breathe, dry out, and things like that, and they don't get, the insulation doesn't get all crushed up and mucked up in them. But I almost always keep my sleeping bags when I'm traveling in some type of a waterproof bag. A, that keeps it dry. B, it just gives me another container. But a waterproof bag is a very good system for that. Now this bag actually is down-filled, and it compresses very, very small. You can put this whole bag into a 10-liter dry bag very, very easily, push it all the way down, and still have room in the top for some type of an improvised bivvy, especially, or some type of a bivvy system, especially a summer bivvy, where you've got something that's made out of bug net and lightweight silnai. You can put that right on the top of this thing, and then all you really need is your sleeping pad, and you've got a complete sleep system in a pretty small package. So the sleeping bags that I've got are going to be in waterproof bags for that reason. I don't keep them that way all the time, but I do keep them that way when I'm traveling. Now, the second sleeping bag that I would recommend, or that I would say is a good sleeping bag, if that's the route you choose to go, is, and I've got a Gore-Tex bivvy on top of it here, so don't pay attention to that in this video, is the black Arctic bag from the MMS Sleep System. Now, I do not carry the green bag, the patrol bag. The reason I don't carry the patrol bag is because, A, if I need an extra layer inside here, I can always use the EcoTat. B, I would rather put a wool blanket inside here, like this merino wool one that doesn't take up much more space in my pack. It's a little heavier, but it doesn't take up much more space than the EcoTat does. And then I have the versatility of this outerwear that I can put around the fire that's going to hold insulation in even if it gets damp or wet. And I can combine that inside this sleeping bag to give me that added warmth. But just this black bag by itself goes down pretty low. Okay, the main problem I have with this bag is it's very warm, it's very durable. I've had this one for a long time. It's got the same mummy hood and everything else in it. And when combined with a wool blanket, like I said, it's just absolutely toasty in frigid cold weather. I've slept in this thing without a wool blanket with just a Gore-Tex bivvy at -9 degrees-ish in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and was toasty warm just laying on a rubber sleeping mat directly on the ground with no cover over my head whatsoever. The problem with this bag is the zip is really not in the center of the bag. It's off to one side where the snaps are, so you can snap this into the rest of the components that go with it. So you might roll over and be laying on this zipper in the middle of the night, and if you had to get out of it quickly for some reason, it makes it a little bit less convenient to get out of, especially if you're laying on the zipper, than something where the zipper is right in the center of the bag. And that can be a problem for you, especially in countries where you have large predators and things like that. But all in all, you know, this sleeping bag is probably one of the warmest sleeping bags I've ever slept in, bar none, without a doubt. So I would definitely recommend this, and they're getting cheaper and cheaper all the time now. They used to be pretty expensive, but they're getting pretty cheap now. So I would definitely recommend this bag to anybody who's looking for a good quality sleeping bag. It does take up some room, it is pretty big, but you can stuff this down in the bottom of your backpack without a waterproof bag, especially if you've got a backpack that's pretty decent and waterproof, and just pack your gear on top of it. Or you can shove it in a waterproof bag like this 30-liter, and this 30-liter will hold not only the sleeping bag, but it will also hold the bivvy, and then you can put this down in your bag as well, and you'll be good to go. You can push this thing down to where it's barely even taking up half of this bag, or just a little over half. It's right to here right now. And then I can put whatever I need to on top of that, like the Gore-Tex bivvy or whatever else, and I've pretty much got a self-contained kit, because I could probably get a tarp in there too if I really wanted to. Okay. Again, if you combine something like this with the mid-weight wool blanket like the one that we saw on our website, then you have the versatility of having the sleeping bag that will go down to a way low temperature. Plus you've got that wool blanket that you can use for outerwear besides just using it for sleeping. Okay, there's one more bag that I want to talk to you guys about real quick, and this bag came from a gun show. It has a really, really large toe box in it. It's a little bit heavier. It's quilted. It's a little heavier duty, I think, than the black Arctic bag is from the MMS Sleep System. And to me, it's every bit as warm. I've been in this thing with a wool blanket before, and it's just really, really warm and comfortable. It's got really wide shoulders in it, as well as having a big toe box. It's got really wide shoulders in it as well, and I like that. It says 1972 on it. It says polyester. Other than that, it doesn't have much writing on it. I'll see if I can read this for you guys. I'll have to put my spectacles on to do that. I'm getting old here. The wording on it looks to be German. If I had to guess. But it says 1972 on it. It says EGE is the manufacturer on it. Like I said, I picked this thing up at a gun show at a really, really reasonable price. I mean, 20 bucks or less, or I wouldn't have bought it. And it just fills a lot of the gaps that I think are missing with the MMS system. Like I said, it's a center zip. It's got really wide shoulders in it, and it's got a really big toe box in it for trapping that heat in there. And I think that those things are really important. It's nice quilted heavy-duty nylon. Like I said, you put a wool blanket in this thing, and you really got something going on. It's got snaps along with the zipper as well. If you wanted to snap it up, I wouldn't do that myself personally, but if you wanted to snap it up just to hold in a little bit more warmth, you could do that. So I wanted to show you this bag because it's kind of an oddball bag that I've never seen before. And I have used it quite a bit. I loan it a lot to students and stuff in winter classes, and some of my instructors, if they don't have a bag, to keep them warm, because I believe in it. You know, I'm not going to give something to a student or one of my instructors and say, hey, use this, if I don't think that it's going to definitely keep them warm. And that's what I keep this around for mainly, but I do use it myself sometimes as well. I just prefer the big fire and the wool blanket for the traditionalism of it. All right, guys, well, I'm Dave Canterbury at the Pathfinder School, and I appreciate you joining me for another video in our basic series today. You know, when it comes to sleeping systems and the way you sleep, you have to do what's comfortable for you. You have to experiment. You have to try different things and find out what works best for you, because what keeps me warm, or my comfort level, may be completely different than your comfort level. So you've got to figure that out. Remember that there's never going to be a wool blanket that's as warm as a good sleeping bag, but there'll never be a sleeping bag that's as versatile as a wool blanket. So there's a tit for tat there that you have to understand, and if you can combine the two, you're that much better off. I thank you for your views. I thank you for your support. I thank you for everything you do for me, for my family, for my school, my sponsors, affiliates, and friends. And I'll be back in another video as soon as I can. Thanks, guys.